Staff Sergeant Kalen stood frozen in the center of his eerily silent, completely empty living room, his heavy combat boots still covered in foreign desert dust. He had survived 15 agonizing, brutal months of military deployment, surviving purely on the thought of running into his wife's warm, loving arms. But there was no welcome home. The furniture was entirely gone. The pictures were ripped off the walls, and resting coldly on the bare kitchen island was a single, devastating piece of paper. It was a finalized divorce decree, already signed by his wife, Seraphine. There was no letter. There was no explanation. Just a cold, sterile signature that completely and violently shattered his heart into a million pieces. For 3 agonizing years, Kalen would live with a burning, profound hatred for the woman he believed had ruthlessly abandoned him while he was fighting for his country. He genuinely believed she was cold, selfish, and heartless, until the fateful day he finally cornered her and discovered the horrifying, soul-crushing secret of why she had actually walked away. And the truth would completely destroy him. Welcome back to Moments and Meanings. Before we uncover the heartbreaking truth in today's story, take a quick second to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and comment down below. Have you ever felt completely betrayed by someone you loved, only to realize years later that they were secretly sacrificing everything just to protect you? In a world where we are so quick to judge people's actions, it is terrifyingly easy to misunderstand the heaviest burdens carried by the ones we love. Today, we are diving into a deeply emotional, high-stakes story about a devoted soldier who came home to an empty house and a devastating divorce, believing his wife simply stopped loving him. But the tragic, beautiful truth hidden behind her cold goodbye will completely shatter your understanding of what true, unconditional love really looks like. Let's begin. Staff Sergeant Kalen was a highly respected, fiercely decorated soldier who was just days away from a dangerous 15-month combat deployment. He was strong, capable, and deeply loyal to his country. But Kalen had one massive, fatal flaw. He was completely, blindingly devoted to his toxic, wealthy family, and he constantly prioritized their arrogant approval over his own wife's feelings. His wife, Seraphine, was the exact opposite of his family. She was a 26-year-old, soft-spoken woman with a heart of pure, unadulterated gold. She didn't come from old money. She worked long, grueling hours as a seamstress in a dusty local tailor shop, wearing faded, inexpensive dresses and driving a battered 15-year-old truck. She loved Kalen with a fierce, unconditional loyalty, silently enduring the constant, vicious disrespect from his family just to keep the peace. On the night before Kalen's deployment, his family hosted a lavish, ultra-exclusive farewell dinner at a sprawling, 5-star country club. Kalen arrived in his pristine, crisp military dress uniform. Standing right beside him were his mother, Victoria, and his older brother, Bram. They were highly arrogant, superficial people whose entire reality was exclusively measured by designer labels, heavy diamond jewelry, and massive trust funds. They absolutely despised Seraphine because she was poor, constantly treating her like dirt beneath their expensive shoes. Seraphine arrived straight from her shift at the tailor shop. She was wearing a simple, inexpensive beige dress she had sewn herself. She looked exhausted, but her eyes beamed with pure, unconditional love for her husband. As she cautiously walked over to the VIP table, Victoria aggressively leaned in and whispered directly into Kalen's ear. "Look at her, Kalen," Victoria sneered, swirling a glass of $3,000 wine, ensuring her heavy diamond bracelets aggressively clinked together. "You are an elite, decorated officer in the United States military, and your wife looks like a cheap, pathetic maid. It is a complete embarrassment to our family's legacy. You should have married someone of your own high-class status, not a charity case." Instead of fiercely and violently defending his loyal wife's honor, Kalen simply sighed, aggressively rubbing the back of his neck. He hated conflict with his mother. "Please, Mom, just let it go for tonight," Kalen mumbled weakly, completely failing to protect the woman who loved him most. Seraphine approached the table with a warm, gentle smile, completely ignoring the venomous glares from Victoria and Bram. She reached into her faded cloth handbag and pulled out a small, carefully hand-stitched fabric pouch tied with a simple piece of leather string. "Kalen," Seraphine said softly, her voice filled with pure, raw emotion. "I wanted to give you your deployment present before we sat down. I made it for you." Bram openly snickered, heavily rolling his eyes at the cheap, pathetic-looking homemade pouch. Kalen took the pouch, his face flushing with deep, toxic embarrassment as he felt his family's judgmental eyes burning into him. He awkwardly untied the leather string and pulled out the gift. It was a small, heavily worn antique silver compass on a plain iron chain. The glass was slightly scratched, and it wasn't shiny or expensive. "What in the world is that piece of garbage?" Bram spat, his voice dripping with toxic disgust. "Is that a joke? You're sending a decorated soldier off to war with a piece of junk from a pawn shop?" "It isn't junk," Seraphine whispered, her gentle eyes filling with hurt. "It was my late grandfather's compass from his own time in the service. It is a symbol of absolute protection. I engraved the back with a promise that no matter how dark it gets, it will always guide you back to my heart. It took me months to restore the internal gears. It was a gift of pure, immeasurable love. It was a priceless, deeply personal sacrifice that proved Seraphine cared about his soul, not his wallet. But Kaelin's fragile ego was entirely overpowered by the wealthy, superficial people sitting next to him. "I have state-of-the-art military GPs, Seraphine," Kaelin sighed, his voice completely devoid of warmth. He didn't even read the beautiful engraving. He carelessly shoved the antique silver compass into his deep pocket, completely ignoring the way Seraphine's gentle smile instantly shattered. "I don't need a cheap broken antique. You're embarrassing me in front of my family. Please, just sit down and try to fit in." Seraphine physically flinched, a single tear of pure humiliation welling up in her kind eyes. But before she could even process the heartbreak of her husband rejecting her soul, she noticed something terrifying. Bram's phone suddenly buzzed on the table. The screen lit up with a highly aggressive, threatening text message from a notorious, incredibly dangerous underground syndicate. "Pay the $2 million by midnight, Bram, or we take your brother's military pension and your mother's estate. We own you." Seraphine's blood ran entirely cold. She stared at the message, her heart pounding violently against her ribs. Bram aggressively snatched the phone away, looking completely panicked, completely unaware that Seraphine had just seen the horrifying, life-shattering truth. Kaelin's toxic, wealthy family wasn't rich at all. They were drowning in massive, dangerous, illegal debt. And worse, they had secretly tied Kaelin's name and his hard-earned military pension to their fraudulent loans. Seraphine looked at Kaelin, who was laughing with his toxic mother, entirely blind to the catastrophic danger hurtling toward him. In that exact moment, Seraphine realized that if she told Kaelin the truth, his loyalty to his family would force him to stay, completely ruining his military career, his clearance, and his freedom forever. She looked down at her empty hands, her heart breaking into a million irreversible pieces. She had absolutely no idea that by keeping this devastating secret to protect the man who had just rejected her gift, she was about to make a sacrifice that would completely destroy her own life. The very next morning, the crushing, heavy reality of Kaelin's deployment loomed over the frantic military base. The tarmac was incredibly loud, filled with the deafening roar of massive transport planes and the tearful goodbyes of devoted military families. Seraphine had stayed awake the entire night, completely paralyzed by pure terror after seeing the horrifying syndicate threat on Bram's phone. She knew that if Kaelin deployed with his finances tied to his toxic family, the dangerous underground criminals would aggressively drain his military pension, completely destroy his elite security clearance, and permanently ruin his life. Desperate to protect the husband she fiercely loved, Seraphine had spent her last few dollars hiring a late-night notary to draft emergency legal documents. It was a secure financial trust designed exclusively to lock Kaelin's military pay away so Bram and Vittoria couldn't touch a single dime while he was in combat. She ran across the windy tarmac, clutching the protective documents to her chest. Her faded beige dress whipping in the cold morning air. She spotted Kaelin standing near the boarding ramp in his pristine desert camouflage, surrounded by his toxic mother and arrogant brother. "Kaelin, wait. Please." Seraphine cried out, completely out of breath as she rushed up to him. Vittoria and Bram instantly sneered, deeply disgusted by her presence. "What do you want, Seraphine?" Kaelin sighed, his voice completely cold and distant, still aggressively holding on to the toxic embarrassment from the dinner the night before. "I am boarding in 5 minutes. Kaelin, you have to sign these papers right now," Seraphine begged, her hands trembling violently as she held out the secure trust documents. "You have to completely separate your bank accounts from your mother and Bram. You are in terrible danger. Please, You have to trust me. Bram's eyes violently widened. He instantly realized that Seraphine had seen the terrifying text message. If Kaelin signed those papers, Bram and Vittoria would be left completely defenseless against the ruthless syndicate. Without a single ounce of hesitation, Bram aggressively snatched the documents from Seraphine's trembling hands. He scanned the legal jargon and immediately orchestrated a highly venomous, completely fabricated lie. Are you completely insane? Bram roared, ensuring Kaelin and the other soldiers could hear. Look at this, Kaelin. She is trying to trick you into signing all your combat pay and your entire pension directly over to her private account. She's trying to steal your money while you're out taking bullets. What? Kaelin snapped, his eyes flashing with sudden venomous rage. No. Kaelin, that is a lie. Seraphine screamed agonizingly, tears violently streaming down her face. I am trying to protect you. Bram is hiding a massive shut your mouth. Vittoria hissed viciously, aggressively stepping between Seraphine and Kaelin. She looked at her son with fake, manipulative tears. We warned you about her, Kaelin. She comes from absolute poverty. She is a desperate, pathetic gold digger. The second you leave, she is going to drain your accounts and abandon you. You cannot trust this cheap seamstress with your legacy. For a normal, loving husband, this would be the exact moment to violently defend his wife's honor and demand the absolute truth. But Kaelin's mind had already been deeply, toxically poisoned by the superficial family he worshipped. His massive, fragile ego entirely took over. Kaelin aggressively snatched the protective documents from Bram's hands. He glared at his fiercely loyal wife with absolute, unadulterated disgust. You couldn't even wait until I was gone, could you? Kaelin spat, his voice dripping with toxic hatred. You just had to secure the bag. You are nothing but a pathetic, manipulative parasite. Kaelin, please, listen to my heart. I am trying to save your life. Seraphine wailed, completely breaking down, desperately reaching for his armored vest. Kaelin forcefully shoved her hands away. Without a single ounce of remorse, he aggressively ripped the protective trust documents into tiny pieces and violently threw them directly into Seraphine's weeping face. I am completely done with you. Kaelin roared over the sound of the plane engines. He turned to his mother. Mom, hand me the military power of attorney forms. I am signing full legal control of my estate and my pension over to you and Bram. I don't want this lying charity case touching a single dime of my money. Absolutely, my brilliant son Vittoria smirked triumphantly, instantly handing him the clipboard. Seraphine gasped in pure, paralyzing horror as she watched Kaelin violently sign away his entire life to the very people who were about to destroy him. Kaelin. No. They owe millions. They will ruin you. Seraphine screamed, falling heavily to her knees on the cold tarmac. But Kaelin didn't even look back. He aggressively threw his duffel bag over his shoulder and proudly marched up the boarding ramp, laughing with his toxic brother. He didn't hug his wife. He didn't kiss her goodbye. He entirely abandoned her in the dust, fully convinced he had just outsmarted a gold digger. As the massive transport plane roared into the sky, Seraphine was left entirely alone, sobbing hysterically on the cold ground. She knew the terrifying truth. Because Kaelin had just legally tied himself to his family, the dangerous syndicate would be coming for his pension and his elite military career the very next day. There was only one impossible, soul-crushing way to save the husband who had just viciously destroyed her heart. She had to take the $2 million debt completely onto her own shoulders. And to ensure Kaelin was legally protected and entirely severed from the violent fallout, she had to file for an immediate, cold, and permanent divorce. She had to break her own heart and completely destroy his, just to keep him alive. 15 agonizing, brutal months later, Staff Sergeant Kaelin finally returned home from his dangerous combat deployment. He stepped through the front door of his house, his heavy combat boots covered in foreign dust, desperately hoping to find some sense of peace. Instead, he found a completely empty, eerily silent living room. The furniture was entirely gone. The pictures were violently ripped off the walls. And resting coldly on the bare kitchen island was a single, devastating piece of paper, a finalized divorce decree already signed by Seraphine. There was no letter, there was no explanation, just a cold, sterile signature. Kaelin's heart didn't just break. It violently shattered into a million irreversible pieces. His toxic ego immediately convinced him that his mother had been absolutely right. He genuinely believed that Seraphine had drained whatever she could and ruthlessly abandoned him while he was fighting for his country. For the next 3 agonizing years, Kalen lived with a burning, profound hatred for the woman he once loved. But without Seraphine's gentle, grounding presence, Kalen's life quickly spiraled into complete emotional isolation. He soon discovered the horrifying truth about his toxic family, though not the full extent of their danger. Vittoria and Bram had aggressively drained every single penny of his combat pay using the power of attorney he foolishly gave them. When Kalen finally cut them off, they completely abandoned him, fleeing the state to escape their own reckless financial disasters. Now, at 31 years old, Kalen was an honorably discharged veteran, but he was a deeply broken, heavily isolated, and profoundly lonely man. He had a decent military pension, but his soul was completely hollow. It was a crisp, beautifully clear Friday afternoon. Kalen had been invited to a massive, highly prestigious military charity gala to receive a Medal of Valor. And he needed his formal dress uniform perfectly tailored. He walked through the upscale, ultra-wealthy downtown district and approached the most exclusive, high-end bespoke atelier in the entire city, L'Eternel Couture. Kalen pushed open the heavy glass doors, stepping into a breathtaking, multi-million-dollar showroom. The space radiated absolute, undeniable elegance, filled with pristine velvet furniture, crystal chandeliers, and elite, ultra-wealthy clients sipping expensive champagne while waiting for their fittings. "Excuse me," Kalen said to the polished receptionist, his voice gruff and tired. "I need a rush alteration on a military dress uniform. I was told the master designer here is the absolute best in the state. She is currently finishing a fitting with the mayor, sir." The receptionist smiled warmly. But she just stepped out. "Right this way." Kalen followed the receptionist toward the massive, brightly lit fitting pedestal in the center of the showroom. As he approached, a woman stepped out from behind the velvet curtains, holding a delicate measuring tape and a piece of imported silk. Kalen's heavy boots instantly stopped moving. The air was violently stolen from his lungs. The absolute paralyzing shock completely froze him in place. It was Seraphine. But she was no longer the exhausted, soft-spoken seamstress wearing faded, cheap, handmade clothes. Seraphine was a vision of breathtaking, undeniable power and true, elegant grace. She was draped in a stunning, custom-tailored ivory silk suit that radiated immense success. Her hair was perfectly styled, her posture was incredibly confident, and she commanded the entire multi-million-dollar room with pure, effortless authority. "Seraphine." Kalen choked out, his voice trembling violently in sheer, unadulterated disbelief. Seraphine slowly turned her head. When her gentle eyes locked onto Kalen, she didn't flinch. She didn't look terrified. She simply looked at the broken, isolated soldier standing before her with a gaze filled with an ocean of unspoken, profound sorrow. "Hello, Kalen," Seraphine said softly, her voice carrying an elegant, completely unbothered calmness that deeply unsettled his fragile ego. Kalen physically staggered backward, his mind violently fracturing. How was this possible? How had the woman he believed was a broke, pathetic gold digger become a highly elite, massively wealthy fashion mogul? All the toxic resentment and blinding rage he had harbored for 3 years aggressively boiled to the surface. He completely ignored the wealthy clients staring at them. "You completely destroyed my life." Kalen snapped, his voice echoing with aggressive, bitter hatred across the pristine showroom. "You ruthlessly abandoned me while I was dodging bullets. You stole whatever you could, slapped divorce papers on my counter, and used my heartbreak to build this massive empire. You are exactly the greedy parasite my mother warned me about." Seraphine didn't yell back. She didn't defend her multi-million-dollar business. She simply handed her measuring tape to an assistant and stepped down from the pedestal. Walking slowly toward the man who had viciously thrown her heart away on a cold airport tarmac. She looked deeply into his angry, broken eyes, entirely prepared to finally unleash the life-shattering, soul-crushing truth that she had carried entirely alone in the dark for 3 agonizing years. "I didn't abandon you to build an empire, Kalen," Seraphine whispered, her voice trembling with a heavy, devastating emotion that completely froze the blood in his veins. "I abandoned you to keep you alive." The pristine, multi-million-dollar showroom fell completely, terrifyingly silent. The elite clients stopped drinking their champagne, staring in sheer disbelief as the broken, heavily isolated soldier stood frozen before the breathtaking fashion mogul. "Keep me alive?" Kalen whispered, his voice cracking into a pathetic, desperate gasp. "What are you talking about? My mother and Bram said you were trying to steal my pension." "Your mother and Bram were drowning in a $2 million debt to a highly dangerous, violent underground syndicate," Seraphine stated, her voice echoing with a heavy, devastating sorrow that cut Kalen straight to the bone. "I saw the threatening text message on Bram's phone the night of the dinner. They had illegally forged your signature. Because you foolishly signed that power of attorney on the tarmac, you were held completely legally liable for every single penny of their massive criminal debt." Kalen's eyes violently widened, his heart completely stopped in his chest. No, that's impossible. The syndicate never came for me. My commanding officers never flagged my security clearance. They never came for you because I didn't let them," Seraphine revealed, dropping the ultimate, soul-crushing twist that would permanently destroy Kalen's reality. "The morning you deployed, I went straight to a high-risk attorney. The only legal, immediate way to completely sever your financial liability from your toxic family was to finalize a hostile divorce. In the divorce settlement, I intentionally claimed absolute, full responsibility for the $2 million marital debt. I completely legally absorbed your family's toxic burden, so your military career and your life would remain absolutely spotless." Kalen gasped so loudly it physically hurt. The air violently vanished from his lungs. His massive, fragile ego instantly shattered into a million irreversible pieces. You took on a $2 million criminal debt?" Kalen choked out, tears of absolute, paralyzing horror welling up in his eyes. "For me? I worked 20 hours a day, Kalen," Seraphine whispered, a single tear of profound exhaustion slipping down her perfectly contoured cheek. "I sewed my fingers until they literally bled. I took on massive corporate contracts. I dealt with terrifying threats from ruthless debt collectors who thought I was you. I built this entire fashion empire entirely out of pure, desperate survival, just to pay off the massive bounty your toxic family put on your head." Kalen began to violently tremble. For 3 agonizing years, he had hated her. He had cursed her name in the trenches. He had genuinely believed she was a heartless gold digger. But in reality, while he was overseas fighting a war, his fiercely loyal wife was fighting a much more terrifying war at home, taking every single financial and emotional bullet to protect the husband who had violently thrown her away. "I was so blinded," Kalen wailed hysterically, violently pulling at his hair. "I believed them. I am so sorry. But..." "Seraphine, how did you survive the first payment? You had absolutely no money." Seraphine looked at him with an ocean of pure, unconditional heartbreak. "I didn't have money. But I gave you everything of value I had. Do you still have the compass, Kalen?" Kalen froze. His trembling hand slowly reached into the deep pocket of his military jacket. He pulled out the small, antique silver compass on the iron chain. It was the exact same compass she had given him at the dinner, the gift he had viciously rejected and called cheap garbage. He had carried it with him every single day of his deployment as a bitter reminder of the wife he thought abandoned him. "You thought it was a worthless piece of junk from a pawn shop," Seraphine said softly, her voice breaking with profound tragedy. "It wasn't just my grandfather's compass. It was an incredibly rare, highly sought-after 17th century solid platinum navigator's artifact. It had been secretly appraised for over $1 million. I gave it to you so that if you ever found yourself in danger you could sell it and survive." Kalen's jaw dropped. His knees physically buckled beneath him. He had unknowingly carried a $1 million treasure in his pocket for 3 agonizing years, entirely too arrogant and too bitter to ever realize its true worth. "Turn it over, Kalen," Seraphine commanded gently. "Read the engraving. You never even looked at it." Kalen's hands shook violently as he turned the heavy compass over. Through his blinding tears, he finally read the delicate hand-carved inscription on the back. "No matter how dark it gets, I will sacrifice everything to guide you home." Kalen completely collapsed. He fell heavily to his knees right in the middle of the pristine, multi-million-dollar showroom, sobbing with an agonizing, soul-crushing grief. His family hadn't loved him, they had used him as a human shield. But Seraphine, Seraphine had literally sacrificed her entire life, her safety, and her heart to save a man who didn't even have the decency to defend her. "Seraphine, please." Kalen screamed agonizingly, desperately holding the platinum compass to his chest as he looked up at her. "I made a massive, catastrophic mistake. I was a weak, pathetic fool. Please, I love you. Let me make it right. We can be a family again. Please." But Seraphine looked down at the weeping broken soldier with eyes that held absolutely no anger, only a deep, permanent closure. He was entirely, profoundly too late. Kalen remained entirely frozen on his knees on the pristine showroom floor, desperately clutching the priceless platinum compass to his chest. His tears violently splashed onto the heavy iron chain. He looked up at Seraphine, frantically pleading with his broken eyes, desperately hoping that the fiercely loyal woman he had married 5 years ago would somehow take pity on him and let him back into her life. "Please, Seraphine," Kalen sobbed, his voice cracking into a pathetic, agonizing wail. "I have absolutely nothing left. My family used me. They left me with nothing. I know I was completely blind, but I am begging you. Let me prove I can protect you this time." Seraphine looked down at the weeping, broken soldier with eyes entirely devoid of anger, but completely empty of the love she once held for him. "I didn't take on that massive burden so you could break my heart a second time, Kalen," Seraphine stated softly, her voice echoing with absolute, undeniable truth. "A true husband doesn't need to be told to protect his wife from his toxic family. He just does it. I sacrificed everything to save your life, but you violently chose their toxic approval over my pure loyalty. And true loyalty is an incredibly fragile gift. Once you violently destroy it, no amount of apologies can ever bring it back." Suddenly, the heavy mahogany door of the private office opened, and a tall, incredibly handsome man stepped out into the showroom. He wasn't wearing a flashy, arrogant suit, but rather a classic, perfectly tailored charcoal blazer. He walked over with quiet, undeniable confidence, and gently placed a warm, loving hand on Seraphine's lower back, looking at her with pure, unconditional adoration. It was Evander, a brilliant, highly respected corporate defense attorney. He was the man who had stood fearlessly by Seraphine's side when the dangerous syndicate came knocking. He was the man who had tirelessly helped her navigate the terrifying legal battles, holding her hand when she was completely exhausted, entirely broke, and terrified. "Is everything all right, my love?" Evander asked softly, his voice a deep, comforting anchor. "Everything is absolutely perfect," Seraphine smiled warmly, her entire face lighting up with a true, safe, and unconditional love. She looked back down at Kalen one final time. "I already have a protector, Kalen. A real one. A man who values my heart, trusts my word, and fights for me when no one else is watching." Kalen let out a loud, agonizing gasp, as if he had just been violently stabbed directly in the chest. He reached his trembling hand out one last time. "Wait. No. Please." But Evander simply looked at Kalen with quiet pity, gently taking Seraphine's hand and leading her back into the private office. The heavy mahogany doors heavily swung shut, completely sealing off the warmth, the wealth, and the unconditional love Kalen had so viciously thrown away on that cold tarmac. The aftermath of Kalen's horrific choice proved to be a lifelong agonizing punishment. While Seraphine spent the rest of her life living in absolute, breathtaking happiness running her massive fashion empire and being deeply loved by a man who truly valued her soul, Kalen's superficial world completely collapsed. Vittoria and Bram, the toxic family members Kalen had thrown away his wife to blindly protect, eventually faced the ultimate consequences. Without Kalen's military pension to shield them, the syndicate ruthlessly turned on them. They were exposed for massive financial fraud, and were both sentenced to decades in a freezing federal penitentiary. Permanently stripped of their fake wealth and arrogant status, Kalen was left completely, terrifyingly alone. Every single day he would sit in his empty, heavily isolated apartment, staring blankly at the priceless platinum compass resting on his table. He was forever haunted by the devastating truth. He had been loved by a woman who was willing to silently absorb $2 million of criminal debt and break her own heart just to keep him safe. He had held a priceless treasure, but he had aggressively traded it all for a toxic family who only saw him as a human shield. And he would spend the rest of his miserable life paying the absolute, soul-crushing price. The lesson in this story: we currently live in a society that constantly conditions us to blindly trust our blood relatives, even when those relatives are deeply toxic, manipulative, and entirely destructive to our own happiness. We are brainwashed into believing that familial loyalty should come before the quiet, steady devotion of the partner who truly has our back. But when you allow the superficial, arrogant voices of toxic family members to poison your mind against a fiercely loyal partner, you are the one who will ultimately lose everything. True love isn't about blood. It is about who is willing to stand in the dark and take the bullets for you when everyone else runs away. If you throw away that kind of pure, unadulterated loyalty just to appease toxic people, you will eventually find yourself entirely alone, holding the devastating pieces of the life you could have had. Every moment has a meaning, but not every truth is easy to face. If this lesson resonated with you, hit the like button and subscribe. Comment loyalty over blood below if you believe that true love means protecting your partner from toxic family members. This is Moments and Meanings by Anne, and I'll see you in the next story.